If you live in North America, you probably have seen this type of wiring if you've worked on anything inside your own house. Now, it's really important to know the differences between this type of wire. Now, trade name, we call it Romex, but it's actually NM wire. It's basically like the difference between Kleenex and tissue, right? So Kleenex is name brand, in this case Romex. So we're going to refer to this type of cable as Romex from here on out. Now, the white stuff over here is 14 gauge, yellow is my 12 gauge, and orange is my 10 gauge. Now they come in different varieties. You can see that these examples have 2 conductors and 1 copper. So they have a white neutral, bare copper ground, and a black hot. And the same goes with each one of these cables. Now, they also come in the option to have 3 conductor. So we call this one is 14.3, but the same goes for 12 and 10. So you can get 12.3 or 10.3 Romex. Now, the only difference between that and the 2 conductor is that there is a red wire in it. Now, this is great for if you're doing like 3-way or 4-way switches, or you're doing a switch leg on an outlet, or if you're doing a 240 volt circuit, you'd have 120 on black, 120 on red, you have a neutral, and you have a ground, and that way from 120 over here to 120 over here, you have 240 volts in between. Now back to the gauge. The gauge of the wire actually refers to how thick in diameter. So 14 gauge, larger the number, smaller the wire. So this is 14, this is 10. 10 is much thicker. Now what does that actually mean for you? The thickness of the wire, the gauge of the wire, actually dictates how much current you can draw on these cables, on these wires, without burning them up. According to the NEC 315B16, there are actually capacity charts. Now these charts dictate how much current can be drawn on your conductor size. 14 gauge, you can draw 15 amps, which would then go on a 15 amp circuit breaker. 12 gauge, you can draw 20 amp, which can go on a 20 amp circuit breaker. And then for your 10 gauge Romex, it's good for 30 amps of current, which you would put on a 30 amp circuit breaker. Now, what does that mean for end-line devices? So this is something else that a lot of homeowners and DIYers get wrong oftentimes. I see a lot of times they'll put this 20 amp receptacle. It even says, they always say the ampacity of the device. So there's a little 20 right there. It says 20 amp. And then also, you know this is 20 amp because it has that little cross, right? It looks like a T kind of. So I cannot put this device on this 14 gauge wire because that would allow someone to plug in a device that can draw more current than my circuit breaker is rated for, which might heat up these cables. See, these have straight blades. This is a 15 amp receptacle. It even says on there. And this can go on this circuit, it can go on this cable, and it can go on this cable, right? Because if I have a 15 amp device, it's not going to overload this circuit, and it won't overload this 30 amp circuit. It can't draw too much power. But if I were to put this 20 amp device on my 14 gauge, 15 amp rated wire, well, I could burn it up. So this is a 20 amp device, which goes on the yellow 12 gauge Romex because it's rated for 20 amps, which this goes to a 20 amp circuit breaker. This is a 15 amp device, which you typically will see on your 14 gauge Romex with a 15 amp circuit breaker. This is one example of a 30 amp receptacle, and this will go on a minimum size of 10 gauge and will be protected by a 30 amp circuit protective device. This 20 amp can go on minimum size of 12, but it can go on higher. This 30 amp device can go on a minimum size of 10 or higher. And again, this 15 amp device can go on a minimum wire size of 14 or higher. So I hope that explains the differences between these types of cable. Hopefully you have a better understanding and you understand that your 14 gauge is good for 15 amps, your 12 gauge is good for 20 amps, and of course your 10 gauge is good for 30 amps. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.